Welcome to Adriana Stories. The first time I noticed the discrepancy, I was reviewing quarterly reports in my home office. It was a Tuesday evening, rain tapping gently against the window pane of our downtown Seattle loft. David had just returned from another business trip to San Francisco, his third this month, and was already asleep on the couch, the glow of the muted television flickering across his face. He looked peaceful, completely unaware that I was about to discover the truth. As I scrolled through the financials for Viridian Dynamics, the tech startup David co-founded, and I helped scale from a two-person operation to a company now valued at over $200 million, something caught my eye. A series of transactions that didn't align with our usual spending patterns. Small at first, $5,000 here, $7,500 there, but consistent. Payments to an entity called Nexus Consulting that didn't appear in any of our official vendor lists. I should have confronted him immediately. That's what most people would do. But I didn't. Instead, I closed my laptop, poured myself a glass of water, and sat on the balcony overlooking the city lights. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. I simply observed the facts as I'd been trained to do in my decade as an operations director. Identify the anomaly, gather evidence, develop a plan. David had always treated me as the quiet one, the supportive wife who managed the household while he changed the world with his visionary ideas. "You handle the details, darling," he'd say with that charming smile that had won over investors and journalists alike. "I'll handle the big picture." At first, I'd believed it was a compliment, a recognition of my organizational skills, but over time I realized it was a cage. A gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. The next morning, as David kissed me goodbye and headed to the office, I began my real work. Not the operations management he thought defined me, but the strategic thinking he'd never credited me with possessing. I started with Nexus Consulting. A quick search revealed it was owned by a woman named Chloe Morrison, 28, who had joined Viridian as a junior developer 6 months ago, the same time David's business trips had increased. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply added her name to my growing dossier. That afternoon, I called Dr. Eleanor Vance, my former professor from business school, who had always seen my potential when others dismissed me. "Maya," she answered on the second ring, her voice warm with recognition. "It's been too long." "Eleanor, I need your advice," I said, keeping my voice steady. "On a purely professional matter." 3 days later, I sat across from her in a quiet corner of the university library, spreading out my findings. She listened without interruption as I explained the financial anomalies, the suspicious timing of David's trips, the way he'd recently begun excluding me from key strategic discussions. When I finished, Eleanor steepled her fingers. "Maya, you've always been the most strategically minded student I've ever taught. You see patterns others miss. But tell me, what do you want to do about this?" I looked out the window at students walking across the quad, carefree in their youth. "I don't want revenge," I said finally. "I want options." Eleanor smiled. "Then let's build you some." Over the next month, I became a ghost in my own life. By day, I remained the supportive wife, preparing David's favorite meals, asking about his meetings, listening patiently as he complained about the pressures of leadership. By night, I worked with Eleanor to map out my escape route. She taught me to think like a chess player rather than a pawn. In business, as in life, the most powerful moves are often the ones your opponent doesn't see coming, she explained during one of our weekly meetings. Your strength isn't in confrontation, it's in preparation. I began documenting everything, every unexplained expense, every late night David claimed was critical to the company. Every time he dismissed my input on strategic decisions with that familiar, patronizing chuckle. I created a secure digital vault, accessible only through a series of encrypted channels I'd learned from Eleanor. Meanwhile, I quietly reconnected with my professional network. Not to complain about David, but to reestablish my credibility as an operations expert in my own right. I started contributing to industry publications under my full name. Maya Chen, not David's wife. I attended conferences where David wasn't invited, presenting on operational efficiency and scaling tech companies. The most important step came when Eleanor introduced me to Robert Kim, a venture capitalist who had once tried to recruit me away from Viridian. Robert doesn't invest in companies, Eleanor explained. He invests in people. Show him what you've built, not what you've lost. Our meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning at a discreet cafe near Pike Place Market. I arrived early, my portfolio carefully organized in a slim leather binder. Robert arrived precisely at 9, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "Dr. Vance speaks highly of you," he began without preamble. "She says you're the reason Viridian scaled so efficiently." I met his gaze directly. "I am. David provides the vision, but I've built the systems that turn that vision into reality." For the next hour, I walked him through the operational framework I'd developed. The hiring protocols, the resource allocation models, the crisis management systems that had kept Viridian functioning through rapid growth. I showed him metrics, not emotions, data, not drama. When I finished, Robert leaned back in his chair. "Why haven't you ever launched your own consultancy?" "Until recently," I said carefully. "I didn't realize I needed to." 2 weeks later, Robert offered me seed funding to establish Chen Strategic Operations, a firm specializing in operational scaling for tech startups. The contract included complete confidentiality until I was ready to go public with the venture. That same week, I discovered the final piece of the puzzle. While David was in San Francisco, I accessed his calendar, a password I'd known since our early dating days, and found back-to-back meetings with Chloe at a boutique hotel in downtown Seattle. Not San Francisco, not even Portland. Here, in our city, while I was at work. I didn't feel anger, I felt certainty. The next day, I transferred my personal savings, carefully accumulated over years from consulting side gigs David knew nothing about, into a new account under my maiden name. I contacted my attorney and began the process of separating our financial holdings. I updated my resume and began reaching out to former colleagues about potential board positions. David remained oblivious. At a company gala that weekend, he pulled me close to his side, his hand possessive on my waist as he accepted congratulations for Viridian's latest funding round. "Look at us," he murmured in my ear. "The perfect power couple." I smiled for the cameras, the perfect supportive wife. Inside, I felt nothing but clarity. The unraveling began subtly. First, David's investors started asking questions about Viridian's financial controls, questions I'd strategically planted through my growing network. Then, Chloe made the mistake of bragging to a mutual friend about her special relationship with the CEO. The gossip spread through Silicon Valley like wildfire. David came home one night, his face pale, his hands shaking. "They know," he said, collapsing onto the couch. "Someone leaked emails between me and Chloe to the board." I poured him a glass of water, playing the concerned wife. "What emails?" "The ones where I promised her a promotion in exchange for—" He trailed off, unable to say it. I sat beside him, my voice calm. "Have you considered that perhaps this is a blessing in disguise? A chance to reset, to be honest with everyone?" He looked at me with desperate hope. "You're not angry?" "I'm concerned about the company," I said carefully. "About our future." He misinterpreted my calm as forgiveness. Over the next few days, he became increasingly dependent on me, seeking my advice on damage control, asking me to help craft his apology to the board. I played along, offering just enough support to maintain his trust while gathering the final pieces I needed. The board meeting was set for Friday. On Thursday evening, David received a call that changed everything. Viridian's lead investor had pulled funding pending investigation into questionable financial practices and leadership instability. Without that capital infusion, the company would collapse within weeks. David paced our living room, his voice rising in panic. "This is a disaster. We're ruined. Do you have any idea what this means?" I watched him from the kitchen, calmly preparing tea. "Actually," I said, I have a proposal." He stopped pacing, hope flickering in his eyes. What? I've been approached by several major tech firms interested in acquiring Viridian's core technology. They see the leadership crisis as an opportunity. I've arranged preliminary discussions for next week. He stared at me, suspicion replacing hope. You've been talking to potential buyers? I've been protecting our interests, I corrected him, as I always have. The next morning, David discovered the truth. Someone, likely Chloe, seeking revenge after David ended their relationship, had leaked screenshots of our financial separation documents to the board. They summoned him for an emergency meeting. When he returned, his face was ashen. They're removing me as CEO, he said, his voice hollow. They're bringing in an interim leader to manage the acquisition process. I nodded, unsurprised. Who have they chosen? Someone named Maya Chen, he said bitterly. Apparently, the board believes operational expertise matters more than visionary leadership right now. I didn't react. I simply poured 2 glasses of wine. One for him, one for me. It's for the best, I said. Viridian needs stability, not charisma, at this moment. He stared at me, really seeing me for the first time in years. You knew this would happen, didn't you? I anticipated several outcomes, I said carefully. This was the most likely. The acquisition process moved swiftly. Within 3 weeks, Viridian was purchased by a major tech conglomerate. David received a modest severance package, enough to live comfortably but far less than he'd expected as co-founder. I received a substantial bonus as the operational architect who had preserved the company's value during the crisis. At the final company meeting, the new leadership announced my appointment as Director of Operational Integration, a position created specifically for me, with a salary triple what David had ever earned. As I stood at the podium accepting the applause, I caught David's eye in the back of the room. His expression was unreadable. That evening, we sat across from each other at our dining table, the same table where we'd celebrated Viridian's early successes, where we'd argued about work-life balance, where we'd pretended everything was perfect. It was you, wasn't it? David asked quietly. You orchestrated this. I considered denying it, but what would be the point? I protected what mattered, I said. The company, my career, my future. Why didn't you confront me? He asked, his voice breaking. Why all the secrecy? Because you never would have believed I could do it, I said simply. And because sometimes the most powerful moves are the ones your opponent doesn't see coming. We decided to separate amicably. The divorce was swift and uncontested. David, humbled by his professional downfall, didn't contest my fair but firm settlement terms. I kept the loft. He moved into a smaller apartment downtown. 6 months later, Chen Strategic Operations had secured its first major client, a Fortune 500 company impressed by my work with Viridian. My office overlooked the same Seattle skyline I'd once admired from our shared balcony, but now the view was mine alone. One rainy afternoon, as I reviewed quarterly reports from my growing firm, my assistant buzzed through. Dr. Vance is here to see you. I smiled. Send her in. Eleanor entered, her eyes scanning the modern office with approval. I see you've made yourself at home. I've made myself visible, I corrected her. There's a difference. She nodded. And David? I looked out at the city. He's consulting for a small startup in Portland. We speak occasionally, professionally. And how do you feel about that? I thought for a moment. Relieved, I said finally. Not because he's gone, but because I no longer need him to validate my worth. Eleanor smiled. That's the real victory. As she left, I returned to my work, the rain tapping gently against the window pane, just as it had on that Tuesday evening months ago. But everything had changed. I had changed. The most powerful revenge, I'd learned, isn't about destroying someone else's world. It's about building your own so solidly that their actions no longer matter. It's about becoming so indispensable, so skilled, so prepared that betrayal becomes merely a stepping stone rather than a stumbling block. In business, as in life, the quiet ones often make the loudest impact. They don't scream their intentions. They don't announce their plans. They simply prepare, execute, and ascend, leaving their doubters wondering when exactly the game changed and how they missed it entirely. I closed my laptop, poured myself a glass of water, and walked to the window. The city lights glittered below, each one representing a possibility, an opportunity, a new beginning. For the first time in years, they were all mine to claim. My phone buzzed with a message from Robert. Another major client interested in your firm. They want to meet next week. I typed my reply. Set it up. I'll be ready. Because I always was, and this time, everyone would know it. The journey to this moment hadn't been easy. Growing up as the daughter of Chinese immigrants in suburban Ohio, I'd learned early that silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. My parents ran a small grocery store working 16-hour days, never complaining, always observing. When a customer tried to cheat them, they didn't argue. They simply stopped serving that person. When suppliers tried to overcharge, they quietly found new ones. Their quiet dignity taught me that power isn't always loud. In college, I'd majored in operations management, while David pursued computer science. He'd been the charismatic one, the one who could talk his way into anything. I'd been the one who made sure his ideas actually worked. When we started Viridian together, it was my spreadsheets that kept us from running out of cash, my processes that allowed us to scale from 3 employees to over 200 in just 4 years. But David had never really seen me as an equal partner. To him, I was the operations person, necessary but not visionary. He'd introduce me at conferences as my wife who handles the boring stuff, never acknowledging that without that boring stuff, his vision would have collapsed under its own weight. I remembered the first time I tried to assert myself at a board meeting, suggesting we delay our Series B funding to strengthen our infrastructure. David had laughed it off. Don't worry your pretty head about that, Maya. Let the men handle the big decisions. The board had chuckled along with him. I'd smiled politely and said nothing. But inside I'd noted the date, the time, the exact words. I'd started my first dossier that day. Over the years, I'd watched as David took credit for my ideas, presented my strategies as his own breakthroughs. When a major client praised our operational efficiency, he'd say, Maya helped with some of the details. When Forbes featured us as the power couple of tech, the article focused entirely on David's visionary leadership, with just a passing mention of his supportive wife. I'd considered leaving multiple times, but Viridian was my creation as much as his. I'd poured my blood, sweat, and tears into it. I wasn't about to let him take it all and leave me with nothing but a pretty story about how I'd supported his journey. The real turning point came when I discovered David had removed my name from the patent applications for our core technology. He'd told the lawyers I wasn't technically involved enough to qualify as a co-inventor. That was the moment I knew I couldn't trust him with anything. Not our money, not our company, not our future. I'd spent months researching intellectual property law, quietly building a case that I was equally entitled to the patents. I documented every meeting, every email chain, every late night I'd spent refining the algorithms that formed the backbone of our product. When the time came, I presented my evidence to the board, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. They'd been shocked to learn how much of Viridian's success was built on my contributions. That experience taught me the most valuable lesson of all. In business, documentation is power. Everything I did from that point forward was meticulously recorded, time-stamped, and stored in multiple secure locations. I'd learned that in a conflict, the person with the best documentation wins, not the person with the loudest voice. After Viridian's acquisition, I made sure to structure my new company differently. Chen's strategic operations would be entirely mine, with clear legal protections and transparent governance. I hired a diverse team of talented women who had been overlooked or underestimated in their previous roles. We specialized in helping startups avoid the operational pitfalls that cause so many promising companies to fail. My first major project was with a young founder named Aisha, whose AI startup was on the verge of collapse due to poor operational planning. She reminded me of myself 20 years earlier. brilliant but naive, passionate but unstructured. I took her under my wing, teaching her everything I'd learned. Maya, she said one afternoon as we reviewed her revised business plan, how did you learn to be so strategic? Most people would have just gotten angry and confronted him. I smiled, remembering those early days. I learned that anger is a luxury we can't always afford. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay calm, gather information, and wait for the right moment to act. It's not about revenge, it's about creating options. Aisha nodded thoughtfully. So it's like chess? Exactly, I said. You don't win by making the loudest moves. You win by thinking 3 steps ahead while your opponent is still focused on the first move. As my company grew, I began speaking at conferences, not as David's wife, but as Maya Chen, founder and CEO. My talks on operational strategy became some of the most attended sessions at tech conferences. People would approach me afterward, thanking me for showing them that operational excellence could be as exciting as any flashy innovation. One afternoon, I received an invitation to speak at the Harvard Business School. As I prepared my remarks, I thought about how far I'd come. I'd gone from being introduced as the operations person to being recognized as an expert in my field. The journey hadn't been easy, but every challenge had made me stronger. The day of my talk, I walked into the lecture hall to find it packed with students and faculty. As I began speaking, I noticed a familiar face in the back row, David. He gave me a small nod of respect, then quietly slipped out. I didn't let it distract me. I continued my presentation, sharing the lessons I'd learned about building resilient organizations and the importance of operational excellence. Afterwards, several students approached me with questions. One young woman, her eyes shining with determination, said, "Your story gives me hope. I've been told I'm too detail-oriented for leadership roles, but after hearing you speak, I realize those details are my strength." "That's exactly right," I said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Your attention to detail isn't a weakness. It's what will make you indispensable. Never apologize for seeing what others miss." As I left the campus that evening, I reflected on how much had changed. I wasn't the same woman who had sat silently while her husband took credit for her work. I was a leader in my own right, respected for my expertise and vision. The most powerful revenge, I'd learned, isn't about destroying someone else's world. It's about building your own so solidly that their actions no longer matter. It's about becoming so indispensable, so skilled, so prepared that betrayal becomes merely a stepping stone rather than a stumbling block. In business, as in life, the quiet ones often make the loudest impact. They don't scream their intentions. They don't announce their plans. They simply prepare, execute, and ascend, leaving their doubters wondering when exactly the game changed and how they missed it entirely. I closed my laptop, poured myself a glass of water, and walked to the window. The city lights glittered below, each one representing a possibility, an opportunity, a new beginning. For the first time in years, they were all mine to claim. My phone buzzed with a message from Robert. "Another major client interested in your firm. They want to meet next week." I typed my reply. "Set it up. I'll be ready." Because I always was, and this time, everyone would know it. In the months following my Harvard talk, Chen's strategic operations continued to grow. We expanded our services to include executive coaching for women in tech, helping them navigate the unique challenges they faced in male-dominated industries. I partnered with several universities to create scholarship programs for women pursuing degrees in operations management. One of my proudest achievements was launching the Silent Ascenders Mentorship Program, connecting experienced female executives with young women just starting their careers. The program's name was a nod to my own journey, the power of quiet preparation and strategic execution. During a particularly busy week, I received a call from the White House. The Office of Science and Technology Policy wanted my input on proposed regulations for AI startups. I was stunned. This was the highest level of recognition I could have imagined. As I prepared for the meeting, I thought about how my immigrant parents would have reacted to this news. They'd worked so hard to give me opportunities they never had, never imagining their quiet daughter would one day advise the government on technology policy. The meeting went exceptionally well. I presented concrete data on how proposed regulations would impact startup growth, particularly for women-led companies. My recommendations were well received, and several were incorporated into the final policy framework. Afterward, a reporter from TechCrunch approached me for an interview. Miss Chen, she asked, how does it feel to go from being the supportive wife to advising the White House? I smiled, remembering all those years of being overlooked. It feels like justice, I said, but more importantly, it feels like proof that operational excellence matters. The people who build the systems that make visions possible deserve recognition too. The article that followed made waves in the tech industry. Several prominent female executives reached out to share their own stories of being underestimated and how they'd fought to claim their rightful place at the table. One afternoon, as I was reviewing proposals for our next round of expansion, my assistant informed me that David was on the line. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to take the call. Maya, he began, his voice cautious. I wanted to congratulate you on the White House recognition. It was well-deserved. Thank you, David, I replied, keeping my tone professional. There was a pause. I've been doing some thinking, he continued, about everything. I realize now how much I underestimated you, how much I took for credit that was rightfully yours. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve that, but I wanted you to know I see it now. I considered his words carefully. Thank you for saying that, David. It means more than you know. Another pause. I've started my own consultancy. It's small, but it's doing well. I've been implementing some of the operational frameworks you developed at Veridian. I couldn't help but smile at the irony. I'm glad to hear it's working for you. We talked for a few more minutes before saying our goodbyes. As I hung up, I realized something important. I no longer felt anger toward him. What I felt was something closer to compassion. He'd had to lose everything to finally see what he'd had all along. The journey from being underestimated to becoming indispensable hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. I'd learned that true power comes not from loud declarations, but from quiet competence. Not from taking credit, but from building systems that work. Not from revenge, but from rising so high that the people who try to hold you down become irrelevant. As I looked out at the Seattle skyline from my office window, I thought about the young woman I'd been 20 years ago, the one who sat silently while her contributions were erased. I wished I could tell her that one day she'd stand here, looking out at this same city, but with the knowledge that she belonged here, that she'd earned her place not through luck or connections, but through skill, preparation, and quiet determination. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Aisha, my protege. Maya, she said excitedly, we just closed our Series A funding. And guess what? I made sure to list you as a strategic advisor in the press release. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. Congratulations, Aisha. You've earned it. As I ended the call, I realized that the most powerful revenge wasn't about what I'd gained for myself. It was about what I could give to others. By sharing my knowledge, my experience, my hard-won wisdom, I was creating a legacy that would outlast any personal victory. The most powerful revenge, I'd learned, isn't about destroying someone else's world. It's about building your own so solidly that their actions no longer matter. It's about becoming so indispensable, so skilled, so prepared that betrayal becomes merely a stepping stone rather than a stumbling block. In business, as in life, the quiet ones often make the loudest impact. They don't scream their intentions. They don't announce their plans. They simply prepare, execute, and ascend, leaving their doubters wondering when exactly the game changed and how they missed it entirely. I closed my laptop, poured myself a glass of water, and walked to the window. The city lights glittered below, each one representing a possibility, an opportunity, a new beginning. For the first time in years, they were all mine to claim. My phone buzzed with a message from Robert. Another major client interested in your firm. They want to meet next week. I typed my reply. Set it up, I'll be ready. Because I always was. And this time, Everyone would know it.